My neighbor kept giving us spoiled food and told the neighbors that we are too poor to refuse. Now she's cooked. My neighbor Dorothy moved in next door 5 years ago and immediately decided she was the neighborhood mother. She'd knock on doors, introducing herself as someone who loved to share her cooking with less fortunate people who probably didn't eat well. I worked from home as a graphic designer, and my wife was a nurse. We cooked fresh meals every night, but Dorothy had decided we needed her help. It started with her bringing over leftovers that were always just past edible. She'd stand at our door holding containers of week-old casserole, saying she couldn't bear to see it go to waste and thought of us. When we'd try to refuse, she'd get teary and say we were too proud to accept help from neighbors. She'd leave the containers on our porch if we didn't answer, and they'd sit in the sun until we got home. The food was always suspicious: meat that smelled off, slimy vegetables, and dairy-based sauces that had separated and turned gray. She'd watch from her window to see if we brought the containers inside, then text asking how we enjoyed her generosity. We'd throw it straight in the trash but tell her thanks to avoid drama. She'd beam and say she knew we needed the help. Then she escalated to giving us her actual expired food. She'd clean out her fridge and bring over milk 2 weeks past date, bread covered in spots she'd say were just flour, eggs that floated when you tested them. She'd package it all in a basket like she was doing us this huge favor, saying she'd noticed we didn't go grocery shopping enough and wanted to make sure we had basics. My wife once made the mistake of saying we'd already been shopping, and Dorothy responded by saying we obviously didn't know how to shop smart if we were wasting money on fresh food when she was providing perfectly good items for free. She started telling other neighbors she was feeding us because we were struggling. At the block party, she announced loudly that she made extra portions every night for the poor couple next door who couldn't afford proper meals. People started looking at us with pity. When we hosted a dinner party with fresh seafood and steaks, Dorothy told everyone we'd maxed out credit cards to show off when we should have just accepted our situation. She'd go through our garbage on trash day checking if we'd thrown away her food. If she found it, she'd knock on our door crying about how we were wasting food when children were starving. She'd guilt us for hours about our privilege of being able to refuse food. She'd bring the thrown-away containers back to our door, saying we should at least try them first. One time she saw me throwing away moldy cheese she'd given us, and she called me wasteful for not cutting around the mold. The breaking point was Thanksgiving. Dorothy brought over her leftover turkey the Monday after, saying she'd saved it especially for us. The smell when she opened the container made my wife gag. The turkey was green and had visible mold. Dorothy said it was just herbs and we were being dramatic. She forced her way into our kitchen and put it directly in our fridge, saying she'd check tomorrow to make sure we'd eaten it because she didn't raise wasteful neighbors. My wife is a nurse and knew that meat could kill someone. We threw it out immediately, but Dorothy saw us do it. She came over screaming that we were ungrateful, and she was going to report us to the health department for unsafe food handling. She actually called them and said we were running an illegal meal service from our home, serving unsafe food to the neighborhood. She thought they'd just fine us and leave. The health inspector showed up the next day. Dorothy was watching from her window, smiling. The inspector looked around our spotless kitchen, checked our fridge full of fresh dated items, and said someone had obviously made a false report. I mentioned Dorothy had been bringing us expired food for years, and we were concerned about her food safety. The inspector asked if she often shared food with neighbors. I said yes, she brought food to everyone on the block. The inspector's face changed. If Dorothy was distributing food regularly to multiple houses, that qualified as food distribution that needed to meet safety standards. The inspector walked straight to Dorothy's house. Dorothy answered the door holding a container she was about to bring to the elderly couple across the street. The inspector identified himself and said he needed to check her kitchen since she was distributing food. Dorothy tried to refuse, but he said he'd already had a complaint and could see she was actively distributing food right now. Her kitchen was a nightmare. The inspector pulled out his phone and started taking photos. Dorothy followed right behind him, making excuses about how she'd been meaning to clean, but just hadn't gotten around to it yet. He opened her refrigerator, and the temperature gauge inside read 52 degrees. He photographed it and wrote something on his clipboard. Dorothy said her fridge had been acting funny lately, but everything was still perfectly safe to eat. He pulled out a container from the back shelf and checked the date. The yogurt had expired 4 months ago. He found another container of what looked like chicken salad that had turned completely gray. Dorothy insisted she'd made that just last week and it was fine. The inspector's face stayed blank, but his jaw got tighter with each thing he found. He moved to her pantry and pulled out canned goods that had rusted through at the seams. He found bags of flour with visible bugs crawling inside. Dorothy said a little protein never hurt anyone, and those bugs were harmless. The inspector photographed everything without saying much. He checked her counters and found cutting boards with deep grooves stained dark from years of cutting raw meat without proper cleaning. He opened her cabinets under the sink and found containers she'd been washing and reusing that had cracks and couldn't be properly sanitized. Dorothy kept talking faster and faster about how she'd always been so careful, and this was all just a misunderstanding. The inspector moved through her kitchen, opening every drawer and cabinet. He found containers of food she'd clearly been saving to give to neighbors. Most of it was expired or showed signs of spoilage. He photographed a casserole dish that had visible mold growing on top that Dorothy insisted was just seasoning that had separated. He checked her freezer and found meat that had been frozen and thawed and refrozen multiple times with ice crystals coating everything. The temperature in the freezer was too warm to keep things properly frozen. Dorothy said she liked to keep it a little warmer so things weren't too hard to cut. The inspector spent almost an hour going through everything, while Dorothy followed him around explaining and justifying each violation he found. He finally closed his notebook and told her he'd be issuing a formal report. Dorothy's voice got shaky, and she asked if this was really necessary over a few small things. He said these weren't small things and walked back to our house. An hour later, the inspector knocked on our door. My wife and I both answered, and he asked if he could come in to explain what he'd found. We sat at our kitchen table and he went through his notes. Dorothy's kitchen had failed inspection on multiple critical violations. The refrigerator temperature was in the danger zone where bacteria grows fastest. She had food stored that was months past expiration. She had cross-contamination issues with raw meat and ready-to-eat foods stored together. Her food storage containers weren't food safe. She had pest contamination in her dry goods. He was issuing citations for all of it. She was ordered to stop all food distribution immediately until she could pass a follow-up inspection. He'd be filing a report with the county, and someone would contact her about the next steps. My wife asked if Dorothy understood how serious this was. The inspector said she seemed to think he was being unreasonable, but the violations were clear. I felt this weird mix of relief that someone official finally saw what we'd been dealing with, and guilt that we'd gotten Dorothy in serious trouble. My wife squeezed my hand under the table. The inspector said we'd done the right thing reporting our concerns because Dorothy's food could have made someone very sick. He thanked us for our time and left. My wife and I sat there for a while, not saying anything. Through the window, we could see Dorothy pacing in her kitchen, talking on her phone. I wondered who she was calling and what she was saying about us. 2 days later, the whole neighborhood knew about Dorothy's kitchen violations and the distribution ban. Jack stopped by while I was getting the mail. He's the elderly guy who lives across the street, and Dorothy had been bringing him food at least twice a week for years. He said he was relieved to hear about the inspection because he'd been throwing away Dorothy's food for years, but felt too guilty to say anything. His wife Caroline came out and joined us on the sidewalk. She admitted she'd gotten food poisoning from Dorothy's potato salad at a block party 2 summers ago, but never connected it until now. She'd been sick for 3 days, but didn't want to hurt Dorothy's feelings by saying anything. Jack said he'd seen Dorothy going through our garbage and wondered what that was about. I explained the whole situation with her, insisting we were struggling and needed her help. Caroline shook her head and said Dorothy had told them the same thing about being worried we couldn't afford to eat properly. Other neighbors started coming over when they saw us talking. Everyone had stories about Dorothy's food. The young couple 2 doors down said they'd been secretly composting all her deliveries. The family with 3 kids said their children refused to eat anything Dorothy brought because it always smelled weird. Person after person admitted they'd been throwing away her food, but felt trapped by her aggressive generosity. Nobody wanted to be the bad guy who rejected help from someone who seemed so caring. Caroline said she'd tried once to politely decline, and Dorothy had cried on her porch for an hour about how lonely she was, and how helping people were all she had. After that, Caroline just accepted everything and threw it away later. The next morning, I found a long handwritten note taped to our front door. It was from Dorothy and filled 3 pages front and back. She wrote that we'd ruined her reputation and destroyed her ability to help people who needed her charity. She insisted her kitchen was perfectly fine, and the inspector was biased because we'd poisoned him against her before he even arrived. The note went back and forth between angry accusations and guilt trips. One paragraph called us ungrateful and selfish. The next paragraph talked about how she'd only ever tried to help us, and we'd repaid her kindness with betrayal. She wrote that she'd been feeding half the neighborhood for years and never had a single complaint until we decided to cause problems. She said the inspector had been unreasonable and found violations that didn't exist just to justify our false report. She wrote that we'd hurt someone who only tried to help us, and we'd have to live with that. The note ended with her saying she'd never forgive us for what we'd done to her. I showed it to my wife when she got home from her shift at the hospital. She read it and said Dorothy still didn't understand that her food was actually dangerous. My wife deals with food poisoning cases at the hospital and knows how bad it can get, especially for elderly people or anyone with a weak immune system. We kept the note in case we needed it later. 3 weeks later, our neighborhood had its regular block party. The atmosphere was completely different from previous years. People were actually talking openly about their experiences with Dorothy's food. Multiple families admitted they'd been secretly disposing of her deliveries for years. Everyone shared stories about feeling trapped by her aggressive generosity. The elderly couple who lived next door to Dorothy revealed she'd cried on their porch for an hour when they'd suggested they didn't need her help anymore. They'd felt so bad they'd accepted her food for another 2 years just to avoid upsetting her. Someone brought up the time Dorothy had announced at a block party that she was feeding us because we couldn't afford proper meals. Several people admitted they'd believed her and felt sorry for us. One neighbor said she'd almost started a collection to help us out financially. My wife and I explained that we both had good jobs and had never needed or wanted Dorothy's help. People seemed embarrassed they'd believed Dorothy's version without asking us directly. The conversation shifted to how Dorothy was doing now. Nobody had seen her much since the inspection. She'd stopped coming to her front porch and didn't wave at people anymore. A few neighbors felt bad about the whole situation, but most agreed the distribution ban was necessary for everyone's safety. 2 days after the block party, Jack called me in a panic. Dorothy had just brought him a casserole, claiming the ban didn't apply to helping elderly neighbors who might not eat otherwise. The casserole smelled off, and he was genuinely worried about Dorothy's inability to recognize unsafe food. He'd called the health department immediately, and they said an inspector would come out the next day. Jack felt bad reporting her, but said he couldn't let her keep distributing food that might make someone sick. The next afternoon, the same inspector who'd checked Dorothy's kitchen the first time showed up at her house. I watched from my window as Dorothy answered the door. The inspector went inside and stayed for about 45 minutes. When he came out, his expression was grim. He stopped by our house on his way to his car and said Dorothy's kitchen was unchanged from the first inspection. She hadn't fixed any of the violations or thrown away any of the expired food. She just kept everything exactly as it was and waited for the ban to be lifted. He was filing an additional violation report for distributing food while under a distribution ban. A week later, Dorothy's sister showed up. We'd never met her before, but she introduced herself as Rachel and said the health department had contacted her as Dorothy's emergency contact. The health department was issuing more serious penalties, including mandatory food safety training and a formal warning that future violations could result in legal action. Rachel had driven in from 2 states away to help Dorothy deal with the situation. She asked if she could talk to us about what had happened. We invited her in and explained the whole 5-year history of Dorothy's food gifts and how it had escalated. Rachel sat at our kitchen table crying and apologizing for her sister's behavior. She said Dorothy had always had control issues, but they'd gotten worse since she retired 5 years ago. Rachel had known something was wrong, but didn't realize how bad things had gotten. She'd thought Dorothy was just lonely, and maybe a little too enthusiastic about helping neighbors. She hadn't known about the expired food or the unsafe kitchen conditions, or Dorothy's insistence that everyone needed her charity. Rachel said she was going to stay for a week to help Dorothy clean out her kitchen and try to get her into therapy. She thought Dorothy might have a hoarding disorder combined with compulsive helping behaviors. She apologized again for everything Dorothy had put us through. Rachel stayed for the full week, and we watched through our window as she helped Dorothy clean out the entire kitchen. They filled multiple dumpsters with expired food and unsafe containers. Rachel threw away everything that couldn't be properly sanitized. We saw her scrubbing Dorothy's refrigerator and freezer completely empty. She brought in new food storage containers and label makers. By the end of the week, Dorothy's kitchen looked completely different through the window. Rachel stopped by before she left to thank us for being patient with Dorothy and to apologize one more time. She said she'd be calling Dorothy every week to check on her progress, and she'd arranged for a therapist who specialized in hoarding behaviors. She hoped Dorothy would actually follow through with the therapy, but couldn't force her to go. Rachel gave us her phone number and said to call if Dorothy started the food distribution again. She seemed genuinely worried about her sister, but also realistic about the challenges ahead. After Rachel left, I couldn't stop thinking about whether reporting Dorothy had been the right thing to do. I kept seeing how much distress this had caused her, and wondering if there had been a better way to handle it. My wife came home from a particularly rough shift at the hospital and found me staring out the window at Dorothy's house. She asked what was wrong, and I told her I felt guilty about the whole situation. My wife sat down next to me and reminded me that Dorothy's food could have seriously hurt someone. She said she'd treated elderly patients like Jack who'd gotten severe food poisoning and ended up hospitalized for days. People with weak immune systems could die from the kind of bacteria that grows in improperly stored food. She said we hadn't reported Dorothy to be mean or get revenge. We'd reported legitimate food safety concerns to the appropriate authority. What happened after that was because of Dorothy's choices, not ours. We talked for a long time about how sometimes protecting people requires actions that feel unkind in the moment. My wife said if we hadn't spoken up and Jack or Caroline or any other neighbor had gotten seriously sick from Dorothy's food, we'd never forgive ourselves. She was right, but I still felt bad about the whole thing. 2 months after the initial inspection, Dorothy completed the required food safety training and passed a follow-up kitchen inspection. Rachel had been calling weekly like she'd promised, and Dorothy had actually been following the new systems Rachel had set up for tracking food dates and maintaining proper storage. The inspector who came for the follow-up told us Dorothy seemed genuinely committed to following the new protocols. Her kitchen was clean and organized, and all her food was properly dated and stored at safe temperatures. She'd thrown away everything expired and bought all new storage containers. She'd even put thermometers in her fridge and freezer to monitor the temperatures. The inspector said she'd passed the inspection, and the distribution ban was lifted. but she'd been warned that any future violations would result in immediate legal action. Dorothy still watched our house from her window, but she hadn't approached us with food or tried to contact us at all. The next week, Dorothy left a folded piece of paper in our mailbox. I pulled it out and saw careful handwriting on lined notebook paper. The note said her behavior had crossed boundaries, and she understood why we'd reported our concerns to the health department. Every sentence felt stiff and formal, like someone had helped her write it. She said she wanted to work toward being cordial neighbors again eventually. The tone was different from her usual emotional manipulation. It felt like an actual apology instead of another guilt trip. My wife read it when she got home from her shift. We sat at the kitchen table discussing what kind of relationship we could handle with Dorothy going forward. My wife said she didn't want Dorothy back in our house ever. I agreed completely. We decided we could manage polite neighbor interactions, but nothing more than that. No food gifts under any circumstances. No long conversations on the porch, just friendly waves and brief small talk about weather or local news. I wrote a response note thanking Dorothy for her apology. I suggested we start with friendly waves and short conversations to rebuild some basic trust. I put the note in her mailbox the next morning. She texted later that day saying she appreciated our willingness to try. The whole exchange felt awkward but manageable. We saw her in her yard a few days later and waved. She waved back without trying to approach us. It was the first normal neighbor interaction we'd had with her in 5 years. 3 months passed without any major incidents. Dorothy kept to herself mostly. We'd see her working in her garden or getting her mail. She'd wave but never tried to bring us anything or start long conversations. Then she put invitations in several mailboxes, including ours, for a small gathering at her house on Saturday afternoon. The invitation said she was serving light refreshments and hoped neighbors could stop by. My wife wanted to skip it, but I thought we should make an appearance to show we were trying. We walked over on Saturday around 3. Dorothy answered the door looking nervous. She'd set up folding tables in her living room covered with store-bought cookies still in their plastic containers. Bags of chips sat unopened next to bottles of soda with the safety seals intact. She kept explaining where everything came from and pointing out the expiration dates printed on the packages. She told everyone multiple times that nothing was homemade. Jack and Caroline were there along with the couple from 2 houses down. Dorothy's hands shook slightly as she opened the chip bags. She seemed genuinely anxious about hosting this gathering. We stayed for about 30 minutes making polite conversation about the neighborhood association meeting and the new stop sign going in at the corner. Dorothy participated but didn't dominate the conversation like she used to. When we left, she thanked us for coming without any dramatic emotional displays. It felt like progress even though the whole situation remained uncomfortable. Jack stopped by our house the following week to borrow our ladder. While I helped him carry it to his garage, he mentioned that Dorothy had asked before bringing over some extra tomatoes from her garden last weekend. He said when he told her no thanks because they had plenty, she just said okay and didn't push it. He seemed genuinely surprised that she'd respected his refusal without crying or guilt-tripping him. Caroline had apparently told other neighbors about this change in Dorothy's behavior. People were reporting similar experiences where Dorothy would offer something, accept a polite no, and move on without drama. The neighborhood dynamic was shifting back toward normal relationships. People weren't avoiding Dorothy anymore, but they also weren't walking on eggshells around her. Conversations at the mailboxes felt natural instead of tense. The block party planning committee even asked Dorothy if she wanted to help organize this year's event. She agreed, but said she'd handle decorations instead of food. Everyone seemed relieved by that suggestion. Rachel called me one afternoon to give us an update. Dorothy had started volunteering at the local food bank 3 days a week. Rachel said the structure and supervision were really helping her sister channel her desire to help people in healthier ways. The food bank had strict protocols about food safety and storage that Dorothy had to follow. She couldn't just decide on her own what food was still good or how to distribute it. Rachel said Dorothy seemed genuinely happier working there. She got the satisfaction of helping people access food without the compulsive controlling behavior that had caused so many problems. The food bank coordinator had even complimented Dorothy's attention to detail with inventory tracking. Rachel thanked us again for being patient during this whole process. She said she knew it hadn't been easy dealing with Dorothy's behavior for so long. She promised to keep checking in regularly to make sure Dorothy maintained these improvements. 6 months after the health inspector first knocked on Dorothy's door, our neighborhood had settled into a comfortable routine. Dorothy and I would wave when we saw each other getting mail or working in our yards. Sometimes we'd have brief conversations about whether it might rain or how the local high school football team was doing. She never brought up the past or tried to force a closer friendship. We never invited her over or accepted any invitations to her house beyond that one gathering. The relationship felt sustainable because both sides understood the boundaries. My wife no longer tensed up when she saw Dorothy outside. The constant low-level stress of dealing with Dorothy's intrusive behavior had finally lifted. Other neighbors reported similar feelings of relief. The whole street felt more relaxed. People weren't avoiding their front yards or timing their trips to the mailbox anymore. We could just be normal neighbors who live near each other without all the drama and manipulation. My wife and I talked one evening about what we'd learned from the whole situation. She said she used to think being kind meant accepting whatever behavior people directed at you. This experience taught her that real kindness sometimes means setting firm boundaries to protect yourself and others. I admitted I'd felt guilty for a long time about reporting Dorothy. My wife reminded me that Dorothy's kitchen could have seriously hurt someone. Jack was in his 70s with health issues. Caroline had diabetes. The elderly couple next door both took medications that weakened their immune systems. Any of them could have ended up hospitalized or worse from food poisoning. We didn't report Dorothy to be mean or get revenge. We reported legitimate safety concerns to the appropriate authority. What happened after that was because of Dorothy's choices and actions, not ours. The experience made us both more confident about setting boundaries in other relationships. My wife had recently told her mother that surprise visits weren't okay anymore. I'd finally confronted a client who kept demanding free revisions outside our contract. Standing up to Dorothy somehow made it easier to stand up in other situations where people were crossing lines. Rachel visited Dorothy every month to check on her progress. She'd call us occasionally to let us know how things were going. Dorothy was still attending therapy sessions focused on her control issues and compulsive helping behaviors. The therapist had diagnosed her with some hoarding tendencies mixed with anxiety about not being needed or valued. The food distribution had given Dorothy a sense of purpose after she retired, but it had spiraled into something unhealthy. Now she was learning to find purpose through appropriate channels like the food bank volunteering. Rachel said Dorothy would probably always have quirks about wanting to help people. The goal wasn't to eliminate that impulse completely, but to channel it in ways that respected other people's boundaries and followed proper safety guidelines. Dorothy had made real progress, but it was an ongoing process. She still had moments where she wanted to control situations or push help on people who didn't want it. The difference was, she could recognize those impulses now and redirect them instead of acting on them automatically. The neighborhood as a whole seemed different after watching everything unfold with Dorothy. People became more willing to have direct conversations about boundaries instead of just avoiding confrontation. The woman 3 houses down finally told the guy across the street that his dog barking at 6 every morning was a problem. He actually apologized and started bringing the dog inside earlier. Jack told the teenagers next door that their late-night basketball games were too loud. They agreed to wrap up by 9 on weeknights. Multiple neighbors mentioned to us that watching how we handled Dorothy gave them courage to address their own difficult relationships. Caroline said she'd finally told her adult son that he couldn't keep asking her for money. The couple down the street set boundaries with the wife's mother about unsolicited parenting advice. It was like the whole neighborhood realized that being polite didn't mean accepting behavior that made you uncomfortable. People could decline help, refuse gifts, and set limits without being mean or causing permanent damage to relationships. The key was being direct and consistent instead of hinting around or avoiding the issue. A year after everything started, Dorothy knocked on our door holding a small potted plant. She said she'd picked it up at the garden center and thought we might like it for our porch. The plant was clearly new with the price tag still attached to the bottom of the pot. It wasn't food, and it wasn't something from her house. My wife and I looked at each other and agreed this felt like an appropriate neighborly gesture. We accepted the plant and thanked her. I went inside and grabbed a generic gift card we kept for situations like this. We gave it to Dorothy as a return gesture. She seemed pleased and said she hoped we had a nice holiday. The whole exchange took maybe 3 minutes and felt completely normal. There was no underlying tension or manipulation, just 2 neighbors exchanging small gifts during the holiday season. After Dorothy left, my wife put the plant on our porch table. We both stood there for a moment looking at it. The plant represented how far things had come from the tense confrontations and spoiled food of the previous year. Dorothy had learned to respect boundaries. We'd learned to set them clearly. The neighborhood had learned that addressing problems directly usually worked better than avoiding them. Sometimes relationships could survive major conflicts if everyone involved was willing to change their behavior and rebuild trust slowly over time. About 8 months after the plant exchange, my wife came home from work with this huge smile on her face. She dropped her bag by the door and told me the hospital board had approved her promotion to charge nurse. She'd been working toward that position for 3 years, taking extra shifts and completing management training courses. The promotion came with a significant pay increase and better hours. We opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving and ordered takeout to celebrate. That weekend, the neighborhood had a spring potluck in the community park. We brought a pasta salad and set it on the long table with everyone else's dishes. Dorothy was there with store-bought cookies still in the plastic container from the bakery. Several neighbors came over to congratulate my wife when they heard about her promotion. Jack shook her hand and said the hospital was lucky to have her in a leadership position. Caroline hugged her and said she deserved the recognition after all her hard work. Dorothy walked over holding a paper plate with some fruit salad. She smiled and said congratulations, that it was wonderful my wife's dedication had paid off. There was no weird undertone about us needing the money or finally being able to afford things, just a normal neighbor being happy for another neighbor's success. My wife thanked her, and they chatted briefly about the nice weather before Dorothy moved on to talk with someone else. Standing there in the park surrounded by neighbors who saw us as we actually were felt really good. We weren't Dorothy's charity project anymore. We were just the couple next door where the wife was a charge nurse and the husband worked from home. 2 months after my wife's promotion, I landed a major client for my graphic design business. A regional restaurant chain hired me to redesign their entire brand identity, including logos, menus, and marketing materials. The contract was worth more than I'd made in the previous 6 months combined. My wife suggested we host a dinner party to celebrate both our successes. We invited 3 other couples from the neighborhood and spent the afternoon preparing fresh salmon, roasted vegetables, and a nice salad. We set up our patio with string lights and put out the good wine glasses we usually kept in the cabinet. When our guests started arriving around 6, Dorothy was working in her front garden. She looked up, waved pleasantly, and went back to pulling weeds. She didn't walk over to inspect our food or ask what we were celebrating. She didn't try to insert herself into the gathering or bring over some container of leftovers. She just stayed in her own yard doing her own thing. The dinner party went perfectly. Everyone enjoyed the food, and we sat outside talking until almost 11. After our guests left and we were cleaning up the patio, my wife mentioned how relaxed she'd felt the entire evening. There hadn't been any background worry about Dorothy showing up uninvited or making comments about our spending. The lack of drama and boundary crossing made us realize how much constant stress her previous behavior had created. We'd gotten so used to being on guard around her that we'd forgotten what it felt like to just be normal neighbors. A few weeks after our dinner party, I ran into Jack while checking the mail. He asked if I had a minute and we walked over to sit on his porch. He told me Dorothy had become a really valued volunteer at the food bank where she worked twice a week. The coordinator there had recently given her recognition for her dedicated service and careful attention to food safety rules. Jack seemed genuinely happy for her. He said it was good to see Dorothy find a healthy way to help people that used her desire to feed others in a positive direction. She followed all their protocols about checking dates and storage temperatures. She took the training seriously and actually helped them improve some of their systems. The food bank loved having her because she was reliable and thorough. Jack said watching Dorothy grow from the situation, instead of just being punished for it, gave him hope that people could actually change when given proper support. I agreed with him. We were glad Dorothy's story hadn't ended with her isolated and ashamed. She'd done the work to understand her problems and found a way to contribute that respected boundaries and safety. It felt like the best possible outcome given how bad things had gotten. 2 years after the health inspector knocked on Dorothy's door, I was sitting on our front porch one Saturday morning with coffee. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the early sunlight. Dorothy was in her garden pulling weeds and checking her tomato plants. She'd started growing vegetables specifically to donate to the food bank, turning her whole side yard into neat raised beds. She looked up, saw me, and waved. I waved back. The interaction lasted maybe 2 seconds and felt completely normal. My wife came out and sat next to me with her own coffee. We watched the neighborhood wake up slowly. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalk. Someone a few houses down was mowing their lawn. Jack and Caroline walked past on their morning walk and stopped to chat for a few minutes about the weather and an upcoming block party. Everything felt functional and appropriate. People maintained good boundaries but were also genuinely friendly. There was mutual respect instead of forced obligations or weird power dynamics. Dorothy had found her place as someone who contributed positively to the community. We had our place as working professionals who were friendly but private. The whole situation had resolved itself in the messy but ultimately positive way real conflicts actually end sometimes. Speaking up had been hard and uncomfortable, but it turned out to be necessary for everyone's well-being. Dorothy got help and accountability that let her grow instead of continuing harmful patterns. We got our boundaries respected and our actual circumstances recognized. Sometimes people can actually change when they have proper support and consequences that push them toward better behavior instead of just punishing them.